9-year-old Daniel Handley from Beckton in East London went missing sometime late in the afternoon of Sunday the 2nd of October, just over a month ago. His mother was expecting him home by 6. He didn't turn up.
It was a cold and gloomy Sunday afternoon in Beckton, East London, on the 2nd of October 1994. Daniel Handley, a helpful 9-year-old, had returned home after earning a few coins at the local supermarket, where he often helped out customers to load their cars with their shopping. As he always did in his free time, he had then asked his mother Maxine if he was allowed to go and play at Alan's house, his best friend. Unknown to the dangers lurking around, Maxine had agreed to his request, with strict instructions to be back at 6 o'clock. However, by the time 6 o'clock had rolled around, Daniel still had not come home. 4 more hours passed and there was still no sign of him. Maxine Handley immediately knew something was wrong and started looking for him. She went door to door, searching, going to all the neighbours with whom she knew to be Daniel's playmates, yet there was still no sign of her son anywhere. Soon hours would turn into days and then weeks, and there was still no sign of Daniel. Witnesses would come forward saying they had seen him riding his silver saddleless bike that night, but all the conflicting information that the police received hindered the investigation. Where was Daniel Handley? Had he run away? Had he been hurt by his mother's abusive boyfriend? Or had he been abducted by someone he didn't know? Law enforcement would look into every possible scenario, each one leading to a dead end. Daniel Charles Handley was born on the 27th of April 1985 to his parents Maxine and David Handley. He was a sweet, loving 9-year-old boy. He was 4'2" with short blonde hair and a bit of a ponytail at the back. Daniel had 5 siblings and was his mother Maxine Handley's 4th child. His mother described him as really friendly. He would help anyone.
He's friendly, loving, and he gets on with everybody. He hasn't got an enemy in the world.
He attended North Beckton Cross Primary School and was popular amongst his peers in the neighbourhood. His usual activities were playing along the street, at his friend's house, or riding around on his mock-up BMX silver saddleless bike. At the time of his disappearance, Daniel sometimes worked at his local supermarket, helping the customers by putting back the trolleys, filling their bags, and loading their cars with their bags. This was a job he did to prevent himself from being at home and to keep himself busy and distracted when he was not playing around on the streets with his friends. Neighbours would say that everyone knew him because he was always out and about and was everywhere. He spent more time in other people's houses than he did at his own. He was in my house most days. I used to give him food and money. He is a very nice boy, but if anyone offered him money, he'd do anything, said Azra Afzal, a former neighbour. Audrey Ferguson, who often looked after Maxine's children, would say, he spent most of his time on the street. He used to go out on the railway and to the buses or just play in the streets with friends. He was one of those kids who was right friendly. He would talk to anyone. Everyone seemed to describe Daniel as incredibly friendly, a chatty, confident kid who would literally talk to anybody. Life at home for Daniel was not peaceful or pleasant, however, which is why he often tried to keep himself busy. His parents had recently divorced in April, although his father had left their home a year prior. In August, Maxine had moved them away from their home in Newark Knock to live with her new boyfriend, Alexander Joseph, in a housing estate in Beckton. In this new home, Daniel never had much of a home life. He was mostly seen playing on the streets or at the Docklands railway line when he was not at school or down at his local supermarket Asda. Maxine really loved her boys, however, she could barely sustain and take care of her sons. Her new boyfriend Alex had a history of violence and was very abusive, and this abuse caused Daniel's 2 elder brothers to leave home when they could no longer bear staying with him. This left just Daniel, his younger brother David, and his immediate elder brother at home with Maxine and Alex. After waiting for a few hours for Daniel to come home, his mother Maxine became worried and decided to go look for him. In the company of her boyfriend Alex, they went looking for Daniel at Alan's house first, Daniel's best friend. Alan's mother had told her that Daniel had left their house at 5:30 p.m. when Daniel's brother had come round to remind him to be back at 6 o'clock. Maxine's boyfriend Alex had also brought up that he had seen Daniel fixing his bike chain around 6:30 p.m. while taking a walk with his friend along the junctions. He had claimed to have reminded Daniel to get home quickly so that his mother did not worry, which he had agreed to immediately after fixing his bike. As the night grew darker and the hours passed, Maxine got more and more worried. She wondered where he could be. She wasn't the best mother, but she loved her son and wanted him home. With no luck finding him herself, a devastated Maxine phoned the police, reporting his disappearance at 10:48 p.m.
That was the last time I see Danny, was that afternoon. He was happy, he come in and he went back out to play.
Following the report from Maxine Handley, the detective in charge, Superintendent Ed Williams, contacted BBC Crime Watch to broadcast the disappearance and ask anyone with information about his whereabouts to call their helpline.
The longer that Danny remains missing, the greater our concern must be for his safety. If you've seen Danny anywhere in the last 4 weeks, please let the incident room know or call us here now.
On the day of his disappearance, he had been wearing a red boiler suit with the word racing stitched to the left pocket. Underneath his red boiler suit, he wore a green jumper and he was also wearing brown boots. They had hoped an outfit that bright would surely get a lot of attention and that they would hopefully get good information and leads about his whereabouts. Meanwhile, law enforcement had drawn up many possibilities. Maybe he had been followed home by a stranger, or he had run away, or maybe someone dear to him had harmed him. Police also brought up the possibility that he might have been abducted for sexual purposes.
Mr. Williams, what do you and your team think might have happened to Danny?
Well, there are a number of possibilities. Firstly, it's possible that Daniel has simply run away from home, which I think is now unlikely. Second possibility is that he may be with some individual that's looking after Daniel, unaware of the uproar that Daniel's disappearance has actually caused. There is a third possibility, and this is my very real fear, that Daniel has been abducted by paedophiles who mean Daniel harm.
Days passed, and Daniel still needed to be found. As fears grew concerning his safety, a big search party was launched by the police and residents of Windsor Park housing estate to search the streets looking for Daniel. They searched an old gasworks site, warehouses, overgrown wastelands, parks, and abandoned homes at Beckton. Still, they could not find Daniel. As more days passed, they feared the chances of Daniel still being alive were becoming slimmer. The police decided to expand the search party to places where his body could be found if he had been murdered. This time the search was bigger.
I didn't want to miss Daniel Handley if he had been taken away or if some accident had befallen him. I launched what was probably the biggest investigation for a missing child in London.
200 officers were sent out to look at large areas of land and waters in the East End area. Police dogs and helicopters were brought in for the operation. 3 volunteer teams of unit officers searched the underwater docks, riversides and lakes, all to no success. There was no sign of Daniel, dead or alive. A police spokesman would say, "We will continue to look for Daniel and we will have to cover every possibility, but I'm afraid that time appears to be running out for him." Superintendent Ed Williams would also say, "It would be foolish to dismiss the idea of an abduction. We have serious concerns for his health. With the cold weather over the last few days, we are increasingly concerned." Daniel Handley's disappearance had made the local neighbourhood scared and wary. They were all frightened for their children's safety and wondered if Daniel had been abducted, or maybe he had been harmed by someone close to home and who was still living in the estate. Posters of Daniel were put up in every corner of the street, and anyone with the information about his whereabouts were asked to report it to the police. Many people reported seeing Daniel that day, but none had any important information that could lead to knowing his current whereabouts. So the police had no choice but to expand the search party to the family house at Lobelia Close in Beckton.
This was a classic difficulty with this kind of investigation, a missing child investigation. We had lots of information coming in from different sources. A lot of that information was actually conflicting. We needed to make decisions, and after very, very careful consideration, I decided that we had very little alternative but to search the family home.
On the 7th of October, just 5 days after Daniel had gone missing, the police, headed by Detective Superintendent Williams, searched the family house in Lobelia Close in Beckton, as well as the family house in Newark Knock, where Daniel had lived 6 months before his parents' divorce. They had hoped they would find a clue or anything as to his whereabouts. However, they found nothing that could help in discovering where he was, but a woolly hat that a child had claimed to have seen Daniel wearing at 7 p.m. was found at the house in Beckton. A forensic search of the garden and lake in a park near his home would later be launched to search for Daniel, yet no sign of a body or any incriminating items could tie anyone to his disappearance. During the investigation, numerous people claimed to have seen Daniel playing along the streets or riding his BMX bike that Sunday afternoon. A boy had claimed to have seen him wearing a woolly hat at around 7 p.m. while riding his bike, the same hat that was earlier found at the Handley house in Beckton. His mother's boyfriend Alex and his friend had also claimed to have seen Daniel fixing his bike chain at around 6:30 p.m. A girl, Michelle Walsh, had also claimed to have seen him riding his bike, wearing his red boiler suit, just after 6:30 p.m. Michelle Walsh would also add that later on she had found Daniel's bike lying on the floor on Eisenhower Drive, but no sign of Daniel. Had Daniel been abducted, or had he abandoned his bike and run away? No one had claimed to have seen him at the train station, neither had anyone claimed to have given him a lift, nor to have seen him outside of Beckton. The possibility that he had run away had now become slim. With all these statements, the police still had no promising lead. The information and the timing needed to be more consistent, as a lot of it was conflicting. On the 16th of October, Detective Williams and BBC Crime Watch, alongside some police officers and witnesses, reconstructed a video file to trace the last known locations and activities of Daniel Handley. During the reconstruction, 2 new promising leads were made. A neighbour had told the police that Maxine had told her that Daniel had come home that evening on the 2nd of October. However, Maxine had earlier claimed Daniel never came home that evening. A month later, on the 3rd of November, Detective Williams would also later announce on BBC Crime Watch that a Moroccan couple had seen a 4-door Peugeot car parked at Tollgate Road, not far from the junction of Columbine Avenue at about 6:30 p.m. on the 2nd of October, the day of Daniel's disappearance. They also said they saw a boy who fit Daniel's description talking to the owners of the car. The boy was said to be wearing a red boiler suit while straddling his bike and leaning forward on the handlebar while talking to the men. One of these 2 men was seen holding a map, standing by the opened rear door side of the car, while the other was seen seated in the driver's seat. The couple immediately sensed that there was something not quite right about this scene, as the car was parked on the wrong side of the road, facing oncoming traffic, so they decided to circle back towards the car to take another look. The 2 men spotted the family driving back past them, so they quickly thanked the boy on the bike and got back into their car. Seeing this, the family was reassured that all was well and that the boy was safe, as they saw him riding off down the road towards his home, so they also drove off. However, a few minutes later, the car was seen parked on the other side of the road, but there was no sign of the boy. With this new information, they found that a lot of it was still conflicting. The statement from Alex saying he had seen Daniel just after 6:30 p.m, the same time Michelle Walsh and the other kids had claimed to have seen him, as well as the woolly hat found during the house search, which a kid had claimed Daniel was wearing at 7 p.m, the exact time he was known to be last seen. The more they looked into the possibility that he had been harmed by a close friend or relative, the more likely it seemed. With Alex's violent history, it would be safe to say that the police needed to look deeper into Daniel's family. Alex had previously attacked Daniel's eldest brother Paul on 2 occasions. First, Alex had thrown him on the floor and kicked him whilst he played a video game in which Paul's winning had infuriated him. The second, he had threatened to kill him and had started strangling him when Maxine refused to give him back his engagement ring during one of their numerous fights. Suspecting neighbours had also attacked Alex, believing he had harmed Daniel, causing the police to keep Alex and Maxine at a police safe house to prevent more attacks.
I was really upset that I had to leave the area, but they only done it for my own good, so the press couldn't get hold of me, TV couldn't get hold of me. A lot of the neighbours did blame me for what had happened, but at the end of the day, then people have got to realise as well, it weren't just my son who was out playing, their children were out too playing with him.
Was Maxine lying? Maybe Daniel had run away, but on the other hand, maybe Alex had hurt him, and Maxine was just covering up for her boyfriend. On the 14th of December, following the circumstantial evidence against Alex Joseph, Maxine's boyfriend, Detective Superintendent Williams arrested Alex and Maxine, and they were taken to the police station in North London. They were questioned closely about Daniel's disappearance. They both had maintained that they did not know his whereabouts. Maxine had been asked if she was covering up for her boyfriend, and she had answered that she was not. However, with no body found and no direct link to them being involved in his disappearance, they could not be charged for Daniel Handley's disappearance. However, Alexander Joseph would later be charged with offences committed against other children and was kept at the psychiatric wing of Pentonville Prison. In addition, Daniel's mother, Maxine Handley, was on remand and would also be charged with similar offences under the Children's Act. Just when the police had thought they were getting closer to finding the truth of what had happened to Daniel, they found themselves with yet another dead end. After all other possibilities had been explored and led to dead ends, the police had decided to face their worst fear, that Daniel may have been abducted for sexual purposes.
We had well over 100 responses from members of the public. What I was looking for were clusters of sightings, a number of people seeing Daniel in one location, but I never got that. The more time went by, the more my concern increased that Daniel was perhaps dead. However, with a new sighting, I had hope, because the sighting was what I considered to be a classic paedophile abduction. And with that new information, we started to look seriously at paedophiles.
Detective Williams would then launch a search into the sex offenders in the area where Daniel was last seen, following the information from the Moroccan couple. He had always believed that sexual predators could have abducted Daniel, and that the information from the couple had resonated with a classic abduction by these types of people. They were now looking for the two men in the silver dark grey car that had been seen parked along Tollgate Road on the 2nd of October. They had gotten several calls from people who had seen the car that evening. However, none had useful information concerning the occupants of the car or how to find them. Community Action Trust would put out a reward of £5,000 for anyone with information leading to the possible abductors of Daniel Handley. Police went searching house to house, knocking on the doors of all known sexual offenders in their database staying in the area, inquiring if they had any information regarding Daniel's disappearance, or if they knew anyone who could help. They searched the homes of all predators staying 1,000 meters from where Daniel was last seen. There was yet again no luck finding these men, or any information that could lead to finding them. All the predators in the area claimed not to know anything about Daniel's disappearance or to have seen him. They would then expand their search to all those living 2,000 meters from the area he had been last seen. The police had hoped they would find a clue about the two men or anything about Daniel's disappearance, but unfortunately they got nothing. 2 months had passed since Daniel's disappearance, yet the police were clueless about his whereabouts. No lifeless body had been found to fit the description of Daniel Handley. No single arrest had been made for his disappearance, and the only suspect they had been a dead end. On the 25th of March 1995, in Bradley Stoke, Bristol, a man was walking his dog near the edge of the Woodlands Golf Club in Trench Lane. As they were about to turn the corner of the scrublands, his eyes caught something that looked like animals had dug it up. At first, it looked like a small safety helmet for children, but then, upon getting closer to it, the man would realize he had just made a ghastly discovery at the golf course. What he had thought was a safety helmet was indeed a young child's skull. Immediately he phoned the police and reported what he had found. Other skeletal remains would be found in a shallow grave at the area after being dug up by the police. No one knew who the child was. Forensic scientists would try to establish the age and sex of the child, as well as the cause of death. Forensic evidence would suggest that the remains could have been there for up to 2 years. The police immediately wondered if the remains could be that of the missing boy, Daniel Handley.
If this was Daniel's body and we didn't know for certain, then this was a very sad event. But also I had to acknowledge that the investigation in London was almost grinding to a halt. We'd almost come to a full stop.
The remains were so badly destroyed that the forensic department found it hard to get any DNA from them. Hence, they could not easily link the remains to Daniel Handley. However, on the 15th of April, the forensic department experienced a breakthrough. Forensic analysis and dental records would show that the remains were that of a young boy about 9 years old. When the remains were analysed and compared with the dental records of Daniel Handley, it was a perfect match. Shreds of clothing on them suggested he was still wearing the boiler suit, which he had been wearing on the day of his disappearance. The police also believed he had been killed soon after his abduction.
I just didn't want to believe it. You know, at the back of my mind I kept saying, no, it's not Danny. Definitely not Daniel. There's a load of kids missing. It's got to be somebody else's kids. I thought they might have made a mistake.
Unfortunately, the scientists could not tell how he had died or how long he had lain on the open lands.
The circumstances under which Daniel's remains were found led me to believe that this was a paedophile abduction, and that became the whole focus of the inquiry. But now, of course, we were looking for not just abductors but paedophiles with knowledge of the Bristol area and London. The selection of Daniel's burial site was no accident. It was very carefully chosen.
It had now moved away from the case of a missing child and was now a murder investigation. Following the discovery of Daniel's body, it was now evident that they needed to find the abductors as soon as possible before another child was killed. The Metropolitan Police and the Avon and Somerset Police would later join forces to carry out the murder inquiry. The police believed that since 1979, pedophiles had killed up to 20 children in East London, but Detective Williams thought it was unusual for these types of abductors to then murder. According to him, murdering children was not one of the factors in their fantasies. However, in Daniel's case, it seemed to have been. The only positive clue the police had in finding the abductors were the two men who were last sighted with Daniel before his disappearance. However, they had no information about these two men. On Sunday, the 23rd of April, the police launched a hunt for the abductors. They started inquiring from home to home of people close by to where Daniel's body had been found in Bristol. They hoped someone had seen or heard something the day he was killed. During the inquiry, they had gotten hundreds of names of pedophiles, yet none was an actual suspect. They were either not in London at the time of the disappearance, or they had credible alibis and nothing incriminating to tie them to Daniel's murder. A lady would, however, walk up to the police officers one day and said she knew some information she thought might help them. She would tell them to look into some men who had abused 6 young boys. One of these men, David Guttridge, had recently opened a shop called Green Fingers at Stoke Gifford for his friend Timothy Moores, with whom he lived with in Cook's Close in Bradley Stoke in Bristol. She would also tell the police that Timothy Moores was formerly a taxi driver who drove a Peugeot while he worked with a taxi company called Guy's Car in London, and that when the body was found, David Guttridge closed the shop and Timothy Moores left for the Philippines. David and Timothy also had a mutual friend called Brett Tyler. Brett's name was also flagged.
This was the first time that the names of David Guttridge, Brett Tyler and Timothy Morse had actually come into the inquiry. We had the names of hundreds of paedophiles and of course all sorts of lines of inquiry. But now this is a full-scale murder investigation. I thought that it was best that I approach Crime Watch again.
On the 18th of May, Detective Williams appeared on Crime Watch once again to broadcast the murder of Daniel. He had said the police believed it was sexual predators who had abducted and murdered Daniel. He had also asked anyone with information on the two men driving the silver, dark grey Peugeot car on Tollgate Road the day of Daniel's disappearance to report them. The next day, a call came in from a psychiatrist dealing with child sex offenders. He had phoned the police and told them his wife had informed him about the boy murdered by child sex offenders in East London. He had said he might know who might have abducted and murdered the boy.
There isn't really a problem about going to the police when working in the child protection field. Although therapeutically there is a traditional confidential agreement between doctors and patients, I don't think that that really holds if we're talking about a matter of child murder or child sexual assault. All people that come to use our service are told at the very beginning that if any matters come to light in the course of therapy that indicates that a child is in danger, then we will have no hesitation in involving the police in some way.
In his statement, the psychiatrist said David Guttridge, a child abuser, had referred himself to him while trying to stop committing crimes. David Guttridge was also worried about the harm one of his close friends, Timothy Moores, could inflict on people in London, so he had also referred his close friends, Timothy Moores and Brett Tyler, to the psychiatrist. At that time, Moores was in prison for child abuse and was due to be released in 1989. However, in 1992, Timothy Moores reached out to the psychiatrist, saying he was interested in young boys and was worried he would abuse a child again, since his fantasy had refused to go away. The psychiatrist thought Timothy Moores was trying to scare him away or make his fantasy feel real by discussing it with another person. He had never imagined that he would try to make this fantasy happen.
I was thinking that he was either trying to shock me and to have an immediate impact on me, or he was in some way trying to make his fantasy real by having a conversation about it with somebody else who was real. In other words, he was making his fantasy exist as a fantasy by discussing it with another person.
Timothy Moores had also told the psychiatrist that he and David Guttridge were running a minicab service in London and that they lived in an apartment above it. He also mentioned that they had a place in Bristol. The same day, another call came in from a retired prison officer. He had phoned their helpline and said, while he worked in the sex offenders wing, he knew of a guy called Timothy Moores who had a sexual fantasy similar to the murder of Daniel. He had said that during one of their compulsory group therapy sessions in prison he had to supervise, Timothy Moores had described his lifelong fantasy of killing a 9 or 10-year-old blonde-haired boy with blue eyes. The revelation from this prisoner had stuck in his mind because it was so rare for prisoners to talk about an intended crime. The prison officer had also said that Timothy Moores shared a cell with David Guttridge and that they had gotten into a relationship. However, Timothy had lost interest in his previous lover when Brett Tyler moved into their wing. With this new information, the police finally had new suspects: Timothy Moores, David Guttridge, and Brett Tyler, and they immediately set out to work finding out everything about these men. Firstly, both David Guttridge and Timothy Moores worked at Guy's Cars in Camberwell. They also had a house in Cook's Close, an estate in Bristol, a few hundred yards from where Daniel's body was found, and half a mile from Timothy Moore's flower shop, which had now been closed after the body was found. The police were immediately keen to arrest all of these men and question them, so that they could find out exactly what had happened to Daniel Handley. At the time they were following this new lead, Brett Tyler was still in the Philippines, while David Guttridge and Timothy Moores were in London. The police officers were sent out to all their properties at the same time to search for the suspects. David Guttridge was found in one of the apartments and arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to abduct and murder Daniel Handley. Guttridge had denied having a hand in the crime. However, he claimed he knew the abductors and had assisted them in fleeing when the body was found. He told the police his boyfriend, Timothy Moores, and his friend, Brett Tyler, were responsible for the abduction and murder of Daniel Handley. David Guttridge said he knew this because Timothy Moores had informed him of the crime when the body was found. He said Moores was at his mother's house and gave them the address. Immediately, a police team was sent out to Timothy Moore's mother's address. However, on getting to the house, only Moore's mother was there, and she had no idea where he had gone. They, however, found a finance agreement receipt in his mother's house with the address of the flat above the minicab office where Timothy Moores had also lived. Timothy Moores was found at his address at Camberwell, South London, and was arrested on suspicion of the abduction and murder of Daniel Handley. Timothy Moores would ask the policeman who had arrested him why it had taken them so long. When asked what he meant by his statement, he answered that he had been expecting a visit from them.
The police have 36 hours during which they can detain a suspect, and after that time they've got to charge them or let them go, unless you can go back to court and obtain a warrant of further detention, and that's often a gamble. I knew the evidence against Morse and Guttridge was slender.
Having just 36 hours to get enough evidence against Timothy Moores and David Guttridge so they could charge them for the crime, the police set about to question the men on their connection with the disappearance and murder of Daniel. During the questioning, Timothy Moores was hesitant to give any statement about his involvement in the crime. He had neither agreed nor denied being responsible for the abduction and murder of Daniel. This gave the police a hard time finding the truth of what had happened and if their suspects were the actual abductors and murderers. On the other hand, David Guttridge would tell the police all Timothy Moores had told him about the crime. However, he maintained that he was innocent of the actual crime but had assisted his boyfriend Timothy by giving him some money and helping him flee. He had told the police that the first day Moores had referred to Daniel's murder was when the details of the car used to abduct Daniel were released on Crime Watch. He had taken him outside and told him he and Brett were responsible for the boy's disappearance and that the police would be looking for a silver, dark grey car. He would tell the police what Timothy Moores had told him about the crime. He would say how Timothy Moores and Brett Tyler had met Daniel along the road, had spoken to him, and had left him. Later they picked him up. Timothy Moores had said Brett Tyler was holding the map outside the car and talking to the boy while he sat in the driver's seat. They had then taken the boy somewhere. The police had finally gotten a glimpse of what had happened to Daniel. However, with the hesitancy of Timothy Moores to collaborate, they knew they were leading to another dead end. They needed to find a way to get a statement from Timothy Moores. The interview teams were then changed, hoping Moores would be more receptive and corroborate with the new interviewer, DC Chris Byrne. Just then, they got a breakthrough. Tim would open up to DC Chris Byrne and confirm that David Guttridge was not involved in the crime.
He was very calm how he spoke. That was quite shocking. I didn't want him to see any disgust, anything in my face which would stop me from talking, so I acted quite casually. And to encourage him to keep on telling me what happened so that we could find more evidence against him, I tried to appear friendly and sympathetic. And he stared off into his own world and started talking about it. And we were talking as though it was two men talking over a football match they'd just watched, over a pint of beer.
He would then go on and say that they had had sex with Daniel and then killed him in the car.
We actually knew for the first time that Morse had abducted him. He'd abducted him in the car, and I knew that we could test that forensically. I knew it had been seized by police, and I knew we actually for the first time had a scene that we could prove that Morse and Tyler had committed this offence.
We found strong forensic evidence in Morse's car, and that enabled us to say positively beyond any doubt that Daniel had been in that car. What we didn't have was evidence confirming that Morse and Tyler had acted together without Guttridge, and we needed really to find some way of proving that that was so. But of course, we never had Tyler. Tyler was in the Philippines. Luckily, we'd found at Cook's Close a piece of paper with an address in the Philippines.
They now had statements from both Timothy Moores and David Guttridge. Only Brett Tyler was missing. The only problem was, Brett Tyler was in the Philippines. Due to the nature of the crime, they knew they would receive a chaotic reaction if the people of the Philippines knew of Brett Tyler's involvement. The operation had to be done quietly without raising any alarm. 2 officers were then sent to the Philippines to extradite Brett Tyler to London. On the 16th of June, Brett Tyler was arrested. The officers from London were invited to search his house. They had found some children and videotapes in the house. The videotapes would later be found to contain child pornography. When questioned about the murder of Daniel Handley, a teary Brett Tyler would say, "Since October, I've been seeing his face everywhere." Brett Tyler would then go on to tell the police a detailed revelation of what had really happened to Daniel that day. The horrific revelation would shock and upset the police to their core, and just the thought that the last hours of Daniel Handley's life were traumatizing and horrible would send chills down their spines.
Tyler was totally shocked to see 2 pale-skinned London policemen walking in on him, and he had had no time to prepare any story or defence for himself. And when he got the opportunity to confess, he used that as a chest-bearing exercise. And because he hadn't had any time to prepare, both Glenn and I felt that the confession he gave us, both in that interview and the later one in Manila, was the closest we have ever come to finding out what actually happened to Daniel on the night of his murder.
The evening of the 2nd of October was like every other normal evening in Beckton. Beckton was peaceful and known to be safe. children would often play alone outside on the streets. This therefore gave Timothy Moores and Brett Tyler the perfect opportunity to commit their crime and to carry out their twisted shared fantasy. When Timothy Moores felt like his fantasy would not just go away, he had shared the details of his new lover, Brett Tyler, and they had agreed to make his fantasy a reality. In the early hours of the 2nd of October 1994, Brett Tyler had gone to a car booth where he had had a few drinks. Later he met with his friend Timothy Moores at Guy's car, and they set about to find the perfect boy who could fit their fantasy. At about 4:30 p.m, they drove out to East Beckton in a Peugeot 405, looking for the perfect, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, 9 to 10-year-old, average-weighted boy who could fit into their fantasy. They had driven for hours without luck. The boys they had been seeing were either overweight, or not blue-eyed, or not blonde-haired. They were getting ready to give up and to leave East Beckton when the perfect boy rode past them. They were unsure of his eye colour, as they could not get a good look at his face, so they followed him and paid close attention to him. Just then his bike stopped, and he had to get off his silver BMX bike to fix his chain. This was the perfect opportunity to get closer to look at this young boy. First they would park the car along the road, pretending to be lost. Then Brett Tyler would come out of the car, holding a map, and asking the boy for directions. They would then be able to get a closer look at the boy and grab him, while Timothy Moores would stay seated in the driver's seat, ready to drive away once the boy had been grabbed. Their plan had worked out easily, except for the couple who had stopped and driven back around to see what they were up to. This had made them uneasy. However, they were able to wait in the side street, and when Daniel had ridden by them again, they lured him back to the car, asking for him to show directions again. This time, the map was placed across the car's back seat, and when he leaned in to show the directions, Brett Tyler pushed him into the car, and Timothy Moores drove away. They had driven off to a flat above the minicab office in London, where each one of them took turns in sexually abusing him, while the other recorded the activity with a camcorder. After being satisfied with their fantasy, they feared David Guttridge would know of their crime, so they set about to dispose of the boy before they were caught. They had driven out to a lay-by near Junction 14 off the M4, where he was also sexually abused again. Timothy Moores would then go to the back seat of the car, where the boy was laying down, and Timothy proceeded to use a knotted rope to strangle him to death. After killing Daniel, they drove to a golf course at Bradley Stoke, close to Timothy Moore's house in Bristol, where they then buried his body in a shallow grave. Then 2 weeks later, they would return to bury the body deeper. The police were horrified to finally know the experience which Daniel Handley had to go through in his final moments. He was not only abducted, but also turned into a sex toy for their pleasure and disposed of like he was worth nothing. The police were determined to charge Timothy Moores, Brett Tyler, and David Guttridge for their involvement in this horrific crime. On the 1st of June 1995, Timothy Moores and Brett Tyler were charged with the murder of Daniel Handley. In addition, David Guttridge was charged with aiding and abetting a criminal to escape. On the 16th of May 1996, at the Old Bailey Court in London, Timothy Moores, Brett Tyler and David Guttridge were charged in court for their involvement in the abduction, sexual abuse and murder of Daniel Handley. Before the trial began, John Bevan, for the prosecution, had warned the jury of 8 men and 4 women. If this sounds like a description of acts callously inhumane and almost beyond belief, that is exactly what this case is about. You will hear evidence about as depressing an example of the dark side of human nature, humans' inhumanity to man, and downright wickedness as you could imagine. As the court was shown a troubling video of Brett Tyler's confession, reliving the murder of 9-year-old Daniel Handley, the jurors were distressed and wept profusely. Mr. Justice Curtis, the trial judge, had to order a short break after 3 women and a man on the Old Bailey jury broke down and sobbed. In this video, Brett Tyler told the police how he and his new lover, Timothy Moores, had snatched Daniel off the street of Beckton as he rode his bike past them. They had sexually abused him and then driven him to a lay-by near Bristol, where they had strangled him with a rope and later buried his body at a golf course. In the video, Tyler confessed, "I got in the back with Daniel and he woke up slightly. He asked me if he was home yet. I said not yet. He then asked, 'Are you going to kill me?' I assured him we would not. We stopped near Bradley Stoke at an M4 motorway lay-by. Tim then got in the back with a rope. He tied a knot in it, then he tied it around Daniel's neck with the knot at the front. He then tried pulling, but he couldn't do it. So he gave me the other piece of rope. I said I couldn't. He said I'd got to, so I started pulling it. I kept telling the boy I was sorry, but he was already dead." Tyler then went on to describe what had happened when they were burying Daniel. "I saw a 10-pence piece which had fallen out of his pocket, so I took it to get rid of it. We put him back in the hole again, filled it up, and then went back to London." Mr. Bevan, the prosecution, would say that Daniel was singled out as the perfect boy for their perverted fantasy because of his looks, adding, if he had not been blonde, presumably he would be alive today. Showing his disgust for their crime, Mr. Judge Curtis, the trial judge, said, "No one in the future can be under any illusion over what a terrible danger you are with your distorted and evil minds. No one is ever likely to know when, if ever, you are safe to go back onto our streets." The jury would also learn that these three men, David Guttridge, age 59, Timothy Moores, age 33, and his new lover, Brett Tyler, aged 30, had all met in prison in the 1980s, during the period they served jail time for sexually abusing children. David Guttridge and Timothy Moores had started a relationship at the prison until Brett Tyler was moved into their wing. Later, Timothy Moores and Brett Tyler started their warped affair and friendship. When Timothy Moores had shared his lifelong fantasy with Brett Tyler, he embraced it, and they planned to execute it. Timothy Moores pleaded guilty, while Brett Tyler retracted his statement, saying that he had not murdered Daniel Handley with Timothy Moores, and pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty to sexual assault and abduction. However, in less than an hour, the jury found Brett Tyler guilty and convicted him for the abduction, sexual abuse, and murder of Daniel Handley. They were both sentenced to life imprisonment and were recommended to stay imprisoned forever. The trial judge, Curtis, on passing the judgment had said, "You two are evil vultures. Your homosexual lusts are directed against other people's sons. No society can tolerate men kidnapping a child off the street. It was inhumane and callous. You are both calculating men, and I don't believe you are truly sorry for what you have done. Because of the nature of the terrible offences and the very high risk you pose to little boys, life means life, and I propose to recommend that you serve exactly that." Brett Tyler was also found guilty of sexual abuse of other children while at his hideout in the Philippines. 2 young boys and a deaf-mute 4-year-old girl were found at his house in Manila. All of these children had been kept by him and his boyfriend, Reyes, in their home, and they were constantly being sexually abused, and these horrendous activities were videoed. Then David Guttridge was found guilty of aiding and abetting a killer to escape to the Philippines and had admitted to perverting the course of justice. He was then sentenced to 30 months imprisonment. On seeing her son's killers and hearing their perverted crime of stealing her son's life, Maxine Handley had left the courtroom too upset to talk. She was, however, grateful to the police for finding his killers and for the life imprisonment sentence they were given. A once safe Beckton was now driven by fear. As a result, parents were more careful with their children. A neighbour, Alison Otogu, while playing with her 4-year-old son Frankie near a park to Daniel's home, had said, "No one has forgotten that little boy. Mums around here are still very careful with their kids." Timothy Moores' mother, Iris Moores, would reveal that Timothy Moores had been sexually abused as a child in child's care, but she would condemn the appalling acts of her son. In 2002, on the 24th of November, Home Secretary David Blunkett decided that the pair of 4 child murderers, Timothy Moores, Brett Tyler, Howard Hughes, and Roy Whiting, should remain in prison until at least 2045, a minimum of 50 years of jail time each. However, the European Court of Human Rights and Human Courts for England and Wales, following a legal challenge by convicted double murderer Anthony Anderson, declared afterwards that the minister's role in sentencing was unlawful. In November 2011, Timothy Moores applied to the High Court in London so that a judge could decide how much longer he should serve. This move brought fresh agony to Daniel's family. Daniel's younger brother David had launched an online petition opposing any move to release Moores early. David Handley had said, "I am doing this for my brother so he can rest in peace, and also for other mothers and fathers out there who would not like to go through this situation. Why should two killers be released back onto our streets to hurt another child and torment other families? I will not let this happen and will do everything in my power to win this case." Referring to Timothy Moores and Brett Tyler, David Handley had also said, "All I want is for them to remain in prison and leave me and my family alone. We have suffered ever since he was taken in 1994, and we still live the nightmare every day. It's time to put a stop to all the pain and hurt. I feel like he is trying to get a shorter sentence so he can be released, but I will not let this happen, ever." However, it would later be decided that the final decision on a life sentence prisoner's minimum term rests with the High Court, following a recommendation by the trial judge. It's so heartbreaking and traumatizing to know that after months of the world wondering where Daniel had been, he had not only been abducted, but also abused and killed by these men. They not only murdered Daniel Handley, but had killed the happiness of his family and sentenced his mother, Maxine Handley, to a life of agony and fear. No mother should ever have to go through what she had gone through. No family deserves to be torn apart for allowing their son to play outside. The sad reality of this case was that Daniel Handley's life was cut short by two evil men with a sick and perverted fantasy.